Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we're heading to a place where the only sound you hear when you open your eyes is the slapping of sandals from 300 naked, sweaty men. Wrestling. This isn't a nightmare, this is ancient Greece, an Athenian gymnasium around the year 450 before the Common Era. No pants, no shirts, just sand, shouting, the smell of rancid olive oil, and a wooden stick to warm up the whole body. Ancient Greece wasn't a place where the body hid, it was where the body shined. So, why did the Greeks exercise in the most primal state of human existence? Was it because they loved beauty? Because they honored strength? Or was it because a wool cloak soaked in sweat stuck to the skin like industrial glue? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft humming background. And let's begin tonight's journey together. If you lived in Athens around 450, before the Common Era, then chances are your body was the most important resume you had. No LinkedIn profile, no color-corrected headshots, just skin, bone, muscle, and the way you ran under the sun. To the ancient Greeks, the human body wasn't something to hide, nor was it a tool for seduction or decoration. It was a kind of truth, a living journal, recording what you had endured, overcome, trained, and mastered. People could lie with words. They could dress like nobles, speak like philosophers. But if you were gasping after a few steps, if your arms couldn't lift a stone weight, then your body would betray you. In Greek culture, physical perfection wasn't separate from moral virtue. They had a word for this ideal: arete, a concept that doesn't translate precisely, but means complete excellence. Arete wasn't just being handsome. It was a body trained to serve the mind, a visible expression of inner qualities: patience, honesty, humility, and self-control. You couldn't have arete just by being good-looking. You had to be good-looking responsibly. And more importantly, you had to master yourself. The Greeks believed in a virtue called enkratia, self-restraint. A truly moral man was one who could stay calm when insulted, stay rational when tempted, and keep his breathing steady while standing naked in a crowd. That's why Greek statues appear still, the body in motion, but the gaze unshaken, not aroused, not awkward, not ruled by desire, but one who has overcome it. That's why the Greeks portrayed their athletes, warriors, and even their gods in sculpture as nude, not to provoke, but because they had nothing to hide. A man who removes all his clothes before a crowd and remains dignified has already conquered the fear of judgment. And if that body had scars, even better. Because the Greeks didn't believe beauty came from luck. They believed beautiful people were the ones who had known pain. The ideal physique wasn't a gift from the gods. It was the result of brutal training. Every drop of sweat, every fall, every pulled muscle left a mark. The body wasn't just a house for the soul. It was the diary of willpower. And that was the virtue the Greeks admired. You could stand before a statue of Apollo, the marble glowing under sunlight, and realize having nothing to hide is a form of power. In that world, nudity wasn't exposure. It was a declaration of honesty. And that's what made Greece different. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs were carved in regal poses, always in ceremonial skirts and crowns. In Assyria, kings hid behind heavy robes, their power wrapped in fabric. But in Athens, around 450, before the Common Era, the gods stepped out of marble, wearing nothing. Not because they were poor, not because they were rebellious, but because they had nothing to conceal. To the rest of the ancient world, nudity meant weakness, slavery, or defeat. To the Greeks, it was heroic and most worthy of honor. And you know what else they believed? That a truly upright man should be noble from the waist up and humble from the waist down. So if you've ever wondered why Greek statues, despite their muscular physiques, often have very modest genitals, that's not a sculpting error. That is a moral philosophy carved in stone. The beginning of the nothing to wear philosophy was a statement. I'm not perfect, but I don't need to pretend. This is me, and my body doesn't lie. People often say, naked is when you have nothing left to hide. But in Athens, around 440 before the Common Era, being naked also meant nothing left to boast about. Gymnasium, from the root gymnos, meaning naked, wasn't just a place to exercise. It was a place that challenged every social assumption. There, aristocrats and commoners stood in the same line. Potters and philosophers shared the same strigil to scrape off sweat. And as they scraped away the oily sand from their skin, they were also shedding the residue of status from the outside world. No badges, no ranks, just clean skin and steady heartbeats. The rich had no cloaks to flaunt. The poor had no stains to feel ashamed of. When everyone was naked, the only thing left to judge was determination. You had no leather shoes to distinguish yourself, no robe to prove your education. All you had left was your body and how you used it. When the body is your only clothing, then willpower is the only thing left to compete with. Sand beneath your feet, the smell of olive oil in the air, the sound of breathing, scattered, then joined together. No footsteps, because no one wore shoes. When a 16-year-old boy slipped and fell, the one helping him up might be a man who once sat on the city council, or he might be a blacksmith, bare-shouldered, calloused hands. At the gymnasium, you didn't know who was who, and that was something magical. Ancient Greece was not an equal society. Slaves were beaten, women couldn't vote, foreigners were banned from the Olympics, and not everyone was allowed into the gymnasium. Only men, with full citizenship, were permitted to be naked in the sandyard. Slaves, foreigners, or anyone without political rights were excluded, which meant, before you could stand as equals, you had to first climb through many layers of status. But the gymnasium, with all its limits, was still one of the few places where citizen men could stand before each other in the same bare height. Someone once wrote, "In the gymnasium, you can't hide your origins, but you don't have to prove them either. You just have to run, and don't stop. If on the streets you were someone low, then in the training yard, you could still be the best javelin thrower. And when you won a wrestling match, the loser might be the son of a senator, and he would embrace you drenched in sweat, but without shame." Nudity in that space was a way to temporarily erase social rank, not forever, but long enough for you to forget who you were and remember what you were: a human, a body, a willpower running between sand and sunlight. And it was in that very place, the gymnasium, that Athens practiced a unique political ideal, not just through slogans, but through dirt, olive oil, and breath. The philosopher Plato once wrote in Laws, "No one should be trusted to govern a city unless he has been educated by sand, olive oil, and sweat." The gymnasium wasn't just a place to build muscle, but a forge for citizens, a place where one learned how to undress and still keep dignity, where every fall into the sand was a lesson in humility, and every time you stood back up was a silent vow to the city you loved. In ancient Greece, the weather wasn't as gentle as in the paintings. The sun burned the skin, sand clung to bare backs, and the white stones underfoot were hot as an oven. Yet strangely, they still stripped down, not because they were liberal, but because clothing got in the way of the most important tool in life, the body itself. A Greek athlete wore nothing during training. Instead, he rubbed olive oil onto his skin, a thin layer, glossy like candle wax, to block the sun, cool the heat, and keep the skin from cracking. After training, he would take a strigil, a curved bronze scraper, to remove the oil mixed with sweat, sand, and whatever remained of the effort. A small act, but one of maintenance, not for beauty, but for the upkeep of a tool. In a world without gym gloves or compression shorts, nudity wasn't a radical idea. It was a practical solution. Clothes, expensive and hard to clean, molded easily, chafed the skin, and caused blisters. A small wound back then could lead to infection, and there were no antibiotics to save you. Bare skin, wiped clean, dried in the sun, and on with the training. You run, you sweat, your eyes squint against the sun, and you hear another pair of footsteps beside you, just as naked. Between two men wearing nothing, there isn't much left to compare, except endurance. And that made the training yard feel like a kind of laboratory. Being naked allowed the trainer and yourself to observe every muscle contraction, every misaligned step. In the slanted light, your shadow cast on the sand became the mirror to correct your posture, stride, and breath. No cloak to hide behind, no loose pants to cover mistakes, just the body and its flaws. The body was no longer something to wear, but a tool to push limits. Every time you lifted stone, leapt, or threw a javelin, you weren't competing with others, you were competing with your own muscles. Just like the Greek warrior, especially the hoplite, a Greek man didn't just need to fight, he had to understand his body like he understood a sword. During training, they didn't wear armor, because armor could protect the flesh, but it couldn't cover weakness. A good warrior was one who could stand firm on bare skin alone. One philosopher once said, "Clothing is the layer between us and the world, but the real body is where the soul is seen most clearly." And that body, if ideal, didn't need to show off. The Greeks didn't worship bulky muscle, but preferred balance, proportion, and harmony. An ideal physique had to look as if it had been measured by the rule of Polykleitos, who sculpted the Doriphoros, the eternal model of a man with self-restraint. The body, not meant to attract the gaze, but to reflect a soul with inner order. But the real body is where the soul is seen most clearly. The Greeks believed that. Plato, in Republic, once emphasized, the body and the soul must be trained at the same time. Xenophon wrote, "The man who knows how to use his body correctly is the one most trusted when the nation calls." So they didn't wear much. They didn't cover the tool that earned them honor, and they took care of it, with oil, with exercise, and with the belief that a body used properly is part of morality. If you think the gym in Athens was just about panting and the smell of sweat, then you're mistaken. Because between the hot sand and the olive oil, there were still conversations about the cosmos. The ancient Greeks didn't separate body and mind the way we do today. They didn't believe a strong man is rarely smart. On the contrary, they believed a trained body is fertile ground for the seeds of philosophy. That ideal was called kalokagathia, the fusion of kalos, beauty, and agathos, goodness. A man was considered ideal only if he had both physical strength and moral nobility. A beautiful body without virtue, to the Greeks, was a betrayal of the very form it inhabited. A trained body is fertile ground for the seeds of philosophy. In the gymnasium, beyond the training yard, there were also philosophical halls. There, when the muscles were sore, people sat down on the ground, beneath the olive trees, and began asking questions with no answers. What is justice? Does the soul have weight? If someone loses in a contest, but overcomes himself, is he still a winner? Socrates once gave lectures in the gym. Aristotle, the teacher of Alexander the Great, taught at the Lyceum, a famous gymnasium in eastern Athens. He walked while teaching, giving rise to a style of philosophy called peripatetic, thinking while walking. This shows the gymnasium wasn't just a place to sweat, but a place where thoughts took root. Plato's dialogue. Charmides opens with a scene of a young man fresh from training, sweaty and shaking with fatigue, being asked about self-control, a moral concept drawn from a trembling body. In the gymnasium, no one wore anything, but no one was more exposed than another. Because when a man takes off his clothes and can still speak of ethics, of truth, then he brings both body and soul together. A trainer might correct your javelin throw, and after practice, beside a water basin and a lyre, you might hear young men reading poems by Sappho or discussing Sparta's latest military campaign. Right there on the sand, music, poetry, and philosophy intertwined to form the ideal figure, a man who knew how to be strong and how to be gentle. But then he might also ask, do you do this to win or to be seen? If no one knew who you were, would you still want to be great? To the Greeks, exercise was not separate from the life of the mind. It was a total ritual, where you bent your body to see your limits and bent your thoughts to realize what you didn't yet know. In that era, the gymnasium was where young men were taught how to become citizens. According to Athenian law, starting around 335, before the Common Era, every eligible youth had to undergo civic training. Ephebeia. They trained to carry armor, studied philosophy to debate, built their chest to absorb impact, and trained their mouths to know when to stay silent, not only with swords and spears, but through hard questions and real bruises. The body met the mind, not to dominate one another, but because in a city-state built on debate and votes, every step you ran, every question you asked, every drop of sweat, was a way of practicing how to live among others. The gymnasium didn't just shape bodies for war, it shaped souls for democracy, to build together people who know how to live. In other civilizations, if you stood naked in public, like in ancient Rome or Persia, you might be banished from the village, stoned, or considered insane. Because to them, nudity meant humiliation, madness, or defeat on the battlefield. But in ancient Greece, if you had the ideal body, you could become a god. The Greeks were sculptors of the soul, but they didn't hide the soul in clouds or mythology. They carved it into flesh. Zeus, Apollo, Hermes, all were portrayed in the nude. Not because the gods had nothing to wear, but because nakedness was a symbol of power. A body uncovered, yet still dignified, that was supreme. And in the world of men, victorious athletes in the ancient Olympics were also sculpted nude. Many were cast in bronze and placed in Olympia, the site of the Olympic Games since 776 before the Common Era, or had statues carved in white stone by their hometowns. When a statue was made, it didn't just record an achievement, it granted the person a sacred quality. They became a milestone between human and divine, set in the town square with name, birthplace, victories, and a body idealized in divine form. You didn't need a throne. You only needed a dream-worthy physique and a will that would not break. But precisely because of this, nudity also became a battlefield. If your body was weak, it betrayed you. If you trained but had nothing remarkable, you were swallowed by the crowd of muscles and perfect forms. In a place where the body was glory, it could also become a prison. And there, you didn't see yourself in a glass mirror. You saw yourself in your shadow on the sand, in your posture stepping onto the podium, in the silent glance of the person training next to you. That shadow, crooked, clumsy, or straight, was the final mirror. People said, the victor shines like a god, but no one spoke of the losers, with narrow shoulders and ragged breath. They quietly walked to the edge of the yard, naked, exhausted, and deeply human. Between those two poles, divine and mortal, the Greeks found a philosophy. No one is born a god, but anyone can train to approach the divine through their own body. To them, the body wasn't just flesh and muscle. It was the image of exposed reason, not deceitful, not hidden. In Greek eyes, the nude body was a symbol of logos, a moral order, a transparency more truthful than words. No one is born a god, but anyone can train to approach the divine through their own body. In the gymnasium, everyone was naked, but no one was the same. Each person was an unfinished draft of the ideal. Some got closer, some drifted further, but no one wore a cloak to hide. And perhaps it was that imperfection that made the Greek human more worthy of a statue than even the gods. Not every great tradition starts with a rousing speech. Some begin with a fall, a slip, a very public wardrobe malfunction on the track. According to an ancient legend, around the 7th century before the Common Era, a sprinter crossed the finish line in a state of complete undress, not by choice, but because the loose fabric of his loincloth had stayed behind at the starting line. He still won. The crowd screamed. The officials were stunned. And from that day forward, people began to think, maybe running naked really is faster. To the point that gymnos, meaning naked, became the root of gymnasium, the word for a sports training ground. Not just an accident, but an official linguistic choice, carved into Greek life as if nudity had never been an issue at all. Some ancient sources suggest the athlete's name may have been Orsippus of Megara. At the Olympic Games of 720, before the Common Era, he ran in the sprinting event, and during a stumble or a slipped waistband, he crossed the finish line, completely nude. We don't know for sure, but if true, then he, with that fateful slip, not only won the race, but opened an entirely new era in ancient Greek athletic history. No statue was ever raised, but he, with that fateful wardrobe mishap, changed the course of the ancient Olympics. From then on, it wasn't just running. Even city-states that had once disapproved gradually gave in. When the Spartans, known for being strict and hard as stone, stepped onto the arena fully nude and still won, no one dared wear clothes again. Soon, all Greek sports, from javelin and long jump to wrestling and boxing, were performed in a state of complete nudity. No numbered jerseys, no shoes, no Nike sportswear, just muscles, olive oil, and the silence of the referee. Some said it was for the spirit of democracy, everyone equally bare. Some said it reflected their philosophical ideal, that physical beauty was a way to honor the gods. But some whispered, honestly, it all started with one guy who lost his loincloth, and people realized it actually kind of worked. Traditions, more often than not, begin as a joke, and the Greeks, with their sharp eyes and unfiltered sense of humor, knew how to turn a fall into a ritual, a moment of embarrassment into a model to follow. The Greeks were good at turning a joke into a philosophy. They didn't need to hide it. They just had to look at each other and know, don't laugh, because tomorrow, the one who laughs might be the one who loses. And so, on black and red figure pottery from the 6th century, before the Common Era in Athens, we see athletes without a thread of clothing, javelins in hand, feet covered in dust, some mid-fall, some flailing their arms like baby birds, and some frozen in awkward poses, but full of truth. And their eyes seem to ask, I'm not wearing anything, but I'm doing something meaningful. And you, fully dressed, what are you doing for your city? On the statue of Apollo, there are muscles. On the statue of the marathon warrior, there are muscles too. But only one of them has scars. The ancient Greeks sculpted statues as if they were writing history in stone. But there was another kind of history that didn't need chisels. It lived right on the skin of the living, in the scrapes, the swellings, the broken fingers, in the wheezing lungs that once breathed in the dust of wrestling rings. In the gymnasium, everyone was naked, and so every scar was exposed. No armor to hide behind, no sheer silk to conceal. Under the glossy layer of olive oil, every scar showed clearer than the words carved into a gravestone. They weren't just old wounds, they were a language that needed no translation. A scar on the thigh might tell you he was a mercenary in Egypt. In Sparta, if you reached 30 without a single scar, people would look at you with suspicion. Because in the agoge system, training from the age of 7, no one made it to adulthood without some trace left behind. A cracked shoulder might point to a former wrestler from Delphi. Every scar was a lecture. No language needed. Just a glance, enough to know. This person has lived, has hurt, has overcome. And when it's your turn to wrestle him, you know you're not just facing muscle, but a past that's very real. They didn't talk about courage, they wore it. In Greek, Andrea, courage, was praised as highly as intelligence. A tear on the chin, a once broken bicep, earned more respect than a philosopher's degree. Scars, in the Greek world, may not have had names, but they spoke louder than Homer's poetry. In some gymnasia, older men were still allowed to train lightly, and no one laughed at them, because they weren't just trainees, they were memory. They came not just to train, but to be present, like living monuments. The young didn't watch them to learn wrestling techniques, but to ask themselves, have I come far enough yet? Not to win, but to keep memory alive in flesh. The kind of memory that doesn't live in the mind, but in a hunched back, that was once straight as a spear. When a young man touched that scar, he wasn't just touching another person, he was touching history, alive, echoing, without needing to be told. And so, the Greek body wasn't a frozen statue, it was a breathing parchment. Every fold, every bruise, a letter, every match, a chapter. No one in the gymnasium needed to brag, because the honor was already written in the skin. If you think everyone got to undress, that anyone could step into the gymnasium to breathe with the sunlight and sweat alongside their comrades, then you've believed too much in the myth. The truth is, nudity was a privilege. A body revealed had to be a body accepted. In the gymnasium, there were no women, no slaves, no foreigners. Women, especially in Athens, were banned from even approaching the training grounds. At Olympia, where the Olympic Games had been held since 776, before the Common Era, married women weren't even allowed to watch. If caught sneaking in, they could be thrown off the Typeum cliff, not because they were weak, but because they didn't belong. The female body in Greek society was something to be shielded, controlled, and guarded like the secret of a household. Even in Sparta, where women were encouraged to exercise to bear strong children, they didn't compete publicly. They didn't step into the male arena. They didn't reach for Zeus with bare arms. And slaves, even if their bodies were as hard as bronze, without the status of citizen, they weren't people, just tools that breathed. They had no names in the gymnasium. They weren't undressed, not because of shame, but because no one cared to look. Their bodies, however muscular, were visible and invisible at once. And foreigners, not Greek? Worse than slaves, they were barbaroi, the ones who spoke strangely, the ones who did not belong. The Olympics and the gymnasium were designed to glorify Hellas, not for outsiders. Sorry, this was a playground for the descendants of Hellas. You might be strong, you might be beautiful, but if you didn't carry that bloodline, you weren't just kept clothed. You were denied identity, denied the right to be Hellenic. The gymnasium wasn't just where clothes came off. It was where worthiness was defined. And the gaze, in those times, was a weapon, a form of power, a permission slip. So when you look at those statues, beautiful like gods, remember, very few ever truly got to be that. The Greek body was never just biology. It was a social license. To be allowed to undress meant you had passed through countless invisible gates of gender, class, and origin. Nudity was not liberation. In ancient Athens, it was a selection, an exam with no paper, no questions, but one that could decide the course of your entire life. You weren't someone until you were granted the right to be naked in public. The statues still stand, white, smooth, unfeeling, abs as hard as iron, arms arched like the roof of the Parthenon. But what about the ones they were modeled after? The ones who once ran on sand, naked under the sun. The ones who threw discs to the gods, who knelt beneath the roar of the crowd. They have faded into dust, into wind, into forgetting, because human skin isn't as lasting as stone. The human body was never meant to be permanent. It's only a borrowed shape, meant to write life into being. The Greeks understood that. They didn't build gymnasia to preserve the body. They built them to preserve the idea of it. Nudity wasn't meant to be remembered. It was meant to be lived. That's why Greek statues wear no clothes. Not because fabric was scarce, but because they wanted to declare, when we are alive, We are the embodiment of something eternal. Your body won't last. It will crack, sag, melt. Time will strip it down, layer by layer, like plaster peeling off an ancient statue. But every time you step into the light, whether it's a gym, a beach, or just a sunlit balcony, every time you choose not to flinch, not to shrink, every time you choose presence over hiding, you're continuing that tradition. The tradition of those who understood. The body doesn't need to last like stone. It only needs to be real enough for someone to remember. You don't have to be a statue. You only have to be someone, brave enough to live as if you deserve to be seen. Did the ancient Greeks believe in aliens? No telescope, no spectral data, no reflectors, towers, or observatories. Just an old man, thin, silver-bearded, sitting by the fire, looking up at the sky and doubting the earth. That was Anaxagoras, a Greek philosopher who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era, and perhaps the first human in history bold enough to say that the sun was not divine. The sun is not a god, he declared. It's a blazing hot stone, bigger than all of Peloponnesus. And the earth is not the center. It's just one celestial body among countless others drifting out there. He didn't just reject a symbol. He peeled the gods out of the sky and laid them bare on the dissection table of reason. If Zeus was the CEO of the heavens, then Anaxagoras was the first to file his resignation on his behalf. And by doing so, he dragged all of Athens into a mild existential crisis. What he said, in that era, wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. Because if Earth wasn't unique, then humanity wasn't special. And you know how people are. There's nothing they hate more than feeling unimportant. His worldview had no neat circle, no heaven, no underworld. It looked more like a wide field with no fences, where stars weren't lucky signs, but real objects, massive, distant, and utterly indifferent to us. And then he asked, if there are countless celestial bodies, then why is there only one place with life? A question echoed, with no answer, no thunder, no reply from the gods, only the wind passing through the thatched roof, brushing against coarse curtains, stirring the firelight, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a nighttime hearth. In the distance, a goat bleated in protest. The wind whistled through stone walls, and everything felt as if the village were floating in a cold, empty universe. And the light from an oil lamp flickered like a truth about to emerge. Anaxagoras was exiled from Athens, not because he drew the wrong maps, not because he spoke with arrogance, but because he touched the divine, and that was off limits. In a city that prided itself on democracy and freedom of speech, sometimes saying that the sun is just a rock was enough to get you labeled a threat. They could debate philosophy, art, politics, but the gods were not to be weighed on the scales of logic. He lived in exile, the cost of daring to imagine a cosmos where humans weren't the center. But his idea didn't die. It fell like a shard of mirror from heaven, reflecting the same old question. But every generation saw something different in it. There were no telescopes, but there was philosophy, no satellite photos, but there was intuition, and a neck that always tilted upward. And maybe that was enough to begin. Because the question he asked, like a stone tossed into a lake, still ripples. From the mouth of a frail old man sitting beside a fire, it drifted through time, reaching minds like Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, and very possibly yours. That idea of a universe not designed to serve us, but to be gazed at, never disappeared. It's just been waiting for the right century to be renamed, with radio waves, with telescopes, or with a dream in the middle of the night. After Anaxagoras, the sky was no longer a sacred, untouchable realm. It began to crack, not from meteors, but from a question, a small question, yet one that hit like a nail into the wooden board of knowledge. What is the world made of? The answer, around the 5th century before the Common Era, came from two names not particularly well known at the time, Leucippus and Democritus. They didn't have Socrates' majestic beard, nor Plato's legion of disciples. They had only atomic theory, an idea that sounds dry, but was actually quite romantic. Everything, from wine to laughter, is made of tiny, indestructible particles called atomos. They collide, connect, break apart, in a universe that functions without needing any gods at all. Atomos, to Democritus, wasn't just matter. It was the seed of the cosmos, invisible, but responsible for everything we call sacred, from the salt on your lips to the first time you were held. If you've ever loved someone, cried to a piece of music, or simply felt warm in the sunlight, then according to him, that's just atomos bumping into each other at the right time. No Zeus, no Apollo, no invisible hand, just dust with intelligence, and a universe moving naturally like breath. Democritus wasn't afraid of randomness. On the contrary, he waded into it like a morning bath in cool goat's milk. He imagined thousands of worlds, each one born from billions of atomic collisions, random but effective. There are worlds without a sun. There are worlds with 2 moons, and among them, perhaps, beings also look up at their sky just like we do. It sounds like something from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, except he worked from a clay yard with a jug of wine and no sponsors. Then came Metrodorus of Chios, a student of Democritus. He wrote one line, short, but sharp enough to make human pride bite its own lip. It is absurd that in a vast field, only one tree would grow, and in an infinite universe, only one world. A gentle slap, yet resonant. No anger, no fire. Just this: reason will not let us be alone forever. To them, the universe was not a stage built just for humanity. We were simply one outcome among billions of atomic experiments, a lucky detour in a long chain of collisions. You might see that as bleak or freeing. Because if life can happen more than once, then loneliness is not a destiny, just a moment. While Athens debated ethics and poets sang hymns to the gods, thinkers like Democritus and Metrodorus quietly imagined countless worlds. No statues were built for them in the public square, but maybe, somewhere, in a world they once dreamed about, there is a small statue beneath a sky with many moons, not made of marble, not standing on a tall pedestal, maybe just a lump of quiet metal dusted by cosmic moss. No visitors, no incense, just stardust and cold light, and on it, not a name, but a single inscription written in a language no one has ever spoken. Thank you for thinking of us first. Amid the clashes of reason, amid colliding atoms, cold equations, and Aristotle's objections, appeared a man, writing letters, Epicurus, not to flirt, not to apologize, but to send something to the universe. In a now famous letter to Herodotus, he didn't recount drinking tales or lecture on virtue, but gently, like speaking to a sleepless friend. There are countless worlds. Some are like ours, some are not. No bold declarations, no thundering logic, just a line soft as wind, and if you were lying awake at night, feeling lost, it would land lightly on your shoulder, like an old friend's hand. Before going further, imagine a windless night in Athens, while people gather in the agora, while Plato debates at his academy in a quiet garden corner. Epicurus writes, "A puppy sleeps at his feet. The oil lamp casts his shadow on the stone wall. On the table, a wooden tablet, a few strokes of ink, and the void. He's not preaching, not praying, not arguing, just sitting there, facing a sky that gives no reply." Epicurus didn't see the cosmos as a laboratory. He saw it as a mailbox with no return address. You write, you seal your hope in the envelope, you toss it into the void. And you know, no one will reply. But you write anyway, because humans, strangely enough, can't survive without the feeling that somewhere, someone understands us. In his world, if gods exist at all, they are silent presences, not angry, not meddling, not impulsive like Zeus. We, he believed, are responsible for our own loneliness. While Aristotle charted the universe as a perfect mechanism, a finely tuned wheel with a prime mover at its core. Epicurus closed his eyes, took no measurements, asked no angles. He just listened. For him, a sigh in the night could be a signal. A faint light could be someone, somewhere, reading alongside him, and quietly exchanging meaning, through thought, through kindness, through questions. Epicurus didn't build temples. He planted trees. No cult, no doctrine, no faith required, just an open gate and a quiet waiting to see who would walk through. People called it the garden, his school. A place where if you were sad, disoriented, or doubtful about the world, you'd be offered tea. There, philosophy wasn't for arguing, it was for breathing. Questions weren't for winning, they were for feeling less alone. He just planted a garden where people sipped tea and talked about death without fear. Maybe he never looked through a telescope, but he looked into the space between the stars and saw that maybe, just maybe, it was the address of another soul, not to meet, but to say hello. If you've ever sent a message that got no reply, if you've ever kept a journal no one reads, if you've ever looked up at the sky and sighed because no one gets you, then you understand Epicurus, the man who sent letters without expecting answers, the one who folded a slip of paper, folded with silence, and slid it into the crack of the universe. And if someday, somewhere far away, someone finds it, he only hoped they'd know. Once, under the dim light of Athens, someone whispered, "Hello." Before there was the word sci-fi, before Hollywood imagined spaceships and wormholes, the Greeks already had something even better. They called it mythology. But if you look closely, beyond the togas, the wine, and the gods of love, you'll see. This was science fiction in robes. Imagine this, a chariot pulling the sun across the sky every day, driven by a being of light. A winged messenger named Hermes, diving through cloud layers at supersonic speed, delivering instant messages from the heavens to earth. A one-eyed giant building massive structures from basalt, living in isolation, far from humankind, as if they came from another planet. Now change a few names, add some CGI, and you've got Thor, Age of Athens. But Greek mythology wasn't just fireside entertainment. It was how people back then explained fear, with symbols larger than themselves. They didn't understand storms, so they said the gods were angry. Didn't understand earthquakes, so they said Poseidon shook his oar. Didn't understand why loved ones died young, so they said Hades needed more souls. They imagined gods, not because they wanted to worship, but because they wanted to control the uncontrollable. to name their helplessness, so they'd feel a little less alone. They had no telescopes, so they called the planets gods. No theory of gravity, so they said Zeus was mad when thunder rumbled. No word for extraterrestrial, so they blamed it all on beings from Olympus. A world where gods could interfere, love, hate, even eat people. They showed up without warning, delivering messages, punishments, or blessings, as if falling from a distant star system, and humans, just spectators, could only look up and kneel. A world where life beyond Earth didn't need space, because it had already fallen from the sky. And the most interesting part, Greek gods weren't good, not all powerful, not all wise. They were very human, jealous, temperamental, mischievous. They were like upgraded versions of modern humans, the first superheroes in human imagination. Zeus had thunder like Thor. Athena had wisdom and strategy like Iron Man. Dionysus partied harder than anyone in Star Wars. Hermes teleported like a galactic agent. Of course, instead of tech suits, they wore togas. And instead of starships, they rode the wind. Instead of power suits and executive chairs, they controlled weather and spied on you in the bath. Someone once said, if you want to understand human psychology, read Greek mythology, because it's humanity's first collective dream report. So if you ask, did ancient Greeks believe in aliens? The answer might be no. But they believed in beings who lived above, who weren't like us, who controlled nature, could abduct you, and sometimes love you to death. And if you're a modern person, just imagine Olympus as an ancient space station, floating in the highest layer of the sky, unreachable, known only through legend. Not a mountain, but an orbit. Not mythology, but the earliest description of an alien civilization. And somewhere, between the thick layers of cloud, in silence, maybe a gaze still watches. Sounds an awful lot like a description of extraterrestrials, doesn't it? The question was never who they believed in. It's that they didn't yet have the right word for it. Not everyone liked a vast sky. Not everyone wanted to believe in countless worlds. Some people, living much later, looked into the void and found it inconvenient. If the universe is too vast, if there are millions of planets, then how do you prove that humanity is the center? How do you hold on to power if every child thinks they're not that special? And so, Earth was pulled back to the middle. Claudius Ptolemy, a Roman astronomer from the 2nd century after the birth of Christ, created a map of the universe, with Earth placed right at the center. The Sun, the Moon, Mars, Venus, Mercury, the stars, all revolved around us, in perfect circular orbits, like a finely tuned machine. The world is a clock, God is the watchmaker, and humanity, naturally, is the one granted the seat of honor. The universe, at that point, became a spherical cathedral, a cathedral with no congregation, just planets performing a holy procession around Earth. And if a planet wandered out of line, no problem. Add another circle, then another. Until the astronomical model looked like the gears of a watch a mechanic was trying to assemble backward. Everything moved, except reason, which was kept still. The problem was, that machine didn't work. Even with all of Ptolemy's calculations, all the added epicycles and adjusted orbits, planets still moved, erratically. Stars refused to stay in place. There were dark spots, solar eclipses, meteor showers, things no one could explain. So instead of fixing the model, they fixed the sky. Not by changing theory, but by bending reality to match belief. For more than 1,400 years, Anyone who dared to say Earth wasn't in the center was considered a heretic. The universe was not to be understood, but to serve a predetermined meaning. Knowledge wasn't for expansion, but for guarding the throne seated inside the cathedral. But then came those who refused to sit still, who couldn't accept the perfect circle, and dared to say, maybe we're just a tiny speck drifting in the dark. But that is another chapter. A chapter about Galileo, Bruno, and Copernicus, those who dared to touch the order of the cosmos, dared to move Earth from the center, and in return, faced exile, silence, or death. There are things that don't need to be discovered, because they were already there, but they still needed someone, or a few someones, willing to look again. Bruno, monk, poet, philosopher, had no telescope. He only had his eyes, his imagination, and a very cosmic loneliness. He looked up at the sky, like so many had before, but instead of seeing celestial bodies revolving around Earth, he saw every star is a sun, and every sun may have a planet, and on every planet, someone may be looking back at us. That gaze was not new, but it was dangerous, because it took away humanity's monopoly on being special. And so, Bruno was burned, not for lying, but for seeing differently. Then came Copernicus, the quiet Pole, sitting in a cold monastery, holding on to his cosmic map like a slow confession. He didn't draw to challenge theology. He didn't draw for glory. He drew like someone trying to rewrite the footnote of existence. The sun doesn't revolve around us. It is we, the small ones, who revolve around the light. He drew a universe without Earth at the center. Everything revolved around the sun. No one was central. No one was favored. He didn't shout. He didn't protest. He simply sent the manuscript to a printer a few days before he died. And then came one last figure, Galileo. He had a telescope. He didn't imagine, he saw. The moon had mountains. Jupiter had moons. Venus had phases like the moon. Earth was just a dot, no more than the others. He didn't stay silent. He wrote books. He debated. He was arrested. And then, one night at trial, when forced to recant, he didn't look up. He didn't argue. He just bowed his head. A soldier looked at him coldly. A cardinal looked at him like staring at a crack in the cathedral wall. And in the thickened air, he whispered, "Still, it moves." Galileo, like a Prometheus chained by silence, not burned but forbidden to speak, not tied to a rock but to a silenced pen. Overlapping gazes, Bruno saw with imagination. Copernicus saw with models. Galileo saw with lenses. 3 pairs of eyes from different times, but landing on the same truth. We are not the center. Bruno, Copernicus, Galileo, like 3 corners of an invisible triangle, redrawing the mental map of humankind. None of them lived long enough to see they were right, but they left 3 dots for the rest of us to start connecting a line. We are just drifting, like dust, in a vast, spinning dance. You might find that sad, but maybe it's the most beautiful thing ever spoken. Because if Earth is not the center, then the gaze looking up is no longer confined by privilege. No one is too big. No one is too small to be allowed to look. You are not more important than a star, but you are not less than a light. In the end, we are not truly searching for aliens, not searching for a new planet, not necessarily even searching for God. What humanity has always been seeking is a mirror. When Anaxagoras said the sun was not a god, but a burning rock, he wasn't denying faith. He was simply wiping off the makeup from the sky to see himself more clearly. When Epicurus wrote letters to a world that never replied, he didn't expect an answer. He just refused to live without knocking on the door of eternity. When Copernicus, Galileo, Bruno, each pulled Earth out of the center, they weren't breaking order. They were returning humility to intelligence. Because the greatest danger is not that the universe is too vast, it's that the ego is too large. When we place ourselves at the center of every orbit, every theory, every truth, we build a curved mirror, one that reflects only our own face and nothing more. But if we dare to step back, to see Earth as a dot, to see ourselves as a speck that thinks, then perhaps we begin to see the whole. Not just planets, not just life, but fragility, glowing. You may not find aliens, but you may discover the truth that you are not alone. Because thousands of years ago, someone else looked up from a roof made of clay and whispered, "Is anyone out there?" And if there is, then answer, even if it's only with a single star. The ancient Greeks who converted to Buddhism. Somewhere in eastern Afghanistan, where no tourist comes for self-growth and the sun could grill chapati on your forehead, there is a stone, no gold beneath it, no gods living inside. Only one thing makes people stop, a line of text. And that line, if you squint to read it, seems to say, Namo Obodo, Namo U, Namo U. Sound familiar? That's right. It's a distorted version of a Buddhist mantra, Namo Buddhaya, or a variation of the ancient refuge vow, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. But instead of being written in Sanskrit, Pali, or any sacred language, it was carved in Greek Bactrian script. Greek Bactrian is an ancient variant of Greek once widely used in Central Asia during the Greco-Bactrian Empire, from around the 3rd to the 1st century before the Common Era. It used the standard Greek alphabet, but was spoken and written with strong influence from local Iranian languages. This language was a direct result of Alexander the Great's conquests, later maintained by Greek dynasties settled in Bactria, the region now northern Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And if you're wondering, why didn't they just translate the mantra into Greek for convenience? The answer might lie beyond grammar and inside the palm of the hand. Because for many faiths, the original pronunciation is sacred, even if the speaker doesn't understand the meaning. Like how medieval Catholics sang Kyrie eleison without knowing it was Greek. Like how millions today sing Hallelujah without knowing it's Hebrew. So that Buddhist mantra in Greek script, misread, misspelled, misunderstood, is still an act of devotion. And sometimes, the sacred isn't in the meaning, but in the rhythm repeated. This stone can chant Buddha's name. It just pronounces it strangely. And the story you're about to hear is a journey backward in time, through Greek temples, Buddhist stupas, the ashes of war, and the philosophical silence of those who said nothing, but understood everything. But if you want an easier picture, imagine a young Greek soldier. He once studied Stoic philosophy at a small academy in Alexandria, Egypt, and read Homer by the Nile. Then war brought him to Bactria, a sunburned frontier of red dust with no room for lofty thought. One day, he met a monk. Neither understood the other, but the monk smiled and recited something like, Namo Buddhaya. No one knows why, but from that day on, the young soldier began repeating it. Maybe he didn't understand, maybe he didn't need to. And one rare quiet afternoon, he carved carved it into stone, not to teach anyone, but to remember. Because for some people, belief begins in a moment of silence, where you've run out of things to argue. Imagine this. One day, you wake up in 250 years before the Common Era. You're Greek, you wear a tunic, and you're kneeling before a statue of Buddha. Not because you've changed religions, but because you're searching for something that Athens never taught. No one would have thought that a man like Alexander the Great, born among the idealistic liars of Greece and died in a haze of wine in Babylon, could end up being the gate opener for the spread of Buddhism. And yet, that's exactly what he did, even though he never intended to. Alexander didn't carry Buddhist sutras in his backpack. He didn't meditate on the battlefield. What he brought was Greek urban architecture, the Greek alphabet, and an insatiable thirst for what was called the known world. In 334 years before the Common Era, Alexander set out from Macedonia, leading an army of fewer than 40,000 men, crossing Asia Minor, cutting through Persia, all the way to the Indus Valley. During his eastern campaign, around 327 years before the Common Era, he crossed the Hindu Kush and entered the region of Gandhara, now northern Pakistan. There, he clashed with King Porus on the banks of the Hydaspes River, one of the bloodiest and most complex battles of his entire career. After his victory, Alexander didn't just build new cities. He spent time interacting with local sages, including Hindu ascetics, Jain monks, and possibly even early Buddhists. Although no historical record mentions Alexander meeting a Buddhist monk, both Strabo and Arrian wrote that he and his entourage encountered the gymnasiums, the naked philosophers who lived in seclusion and practiced meditation in the Indus region. Some modern scholars believe that among them may have been early Buddhists. And in every place he reached, he didn't just plant flags, he built cities. Among them, Ai-Khanoum stands out, a Greek city founded on the Afghan frontier, dubbed by modern archaeologists as Alexandria on the Oxus. Though not all agree whether it was one of Alexander's many Alexandrias, its urban layout and architecture scream Greek influence, from gymnasiums and semicircular theatres to temples dedicated to Hermes and Heracles. Ai-Khanoum wasn't a military outpost or a trading post. It was a proper city, with educated citizens, Greek sculptures, and philosophical inscriptions etched onto tombstones. One of the most notable finds was a stone stele engraved with maxims from the Oracle of Delphi, including the classic philosophical advice, "Know thyself." A Bactrian noble chose to inscribe that on his tomb, in a land nearly 4,000 kilometers from Greece. Perhaps he believed Delphi's wisdom would guide him in the afterlife. Or maybe he simply wanted to carry a piece of Athens into the heart of Central Asia. New Alexandrias sprouted like mushrooms, some in Egypt, some in Central Asia, and at least one right in what is now Afghanistan. Archaeologists call it Ai-Khanoum. Alexander may have just called it a place good enough to build a gym. Ai-Khanoum wasn't a military base, but a real Greek city. It had a theatre, a gymnasium, temples to Hermes, and even a tombstone engraved with a quote from the Oracle of Delphi. More than that, people there read Plato, believed in Zeus, drank wine, and lived in a place almost 4,000 kilometers from Greece. And then, in that very place, a few generations later, they began placing Buddha statues beside Doric columns. A serene Buddha statue, seated in the red brick courtyard of Ai-Khanoum. Behind it, a row of Greek Doric columns, straight, classical, as if still waiting for a Socratic debate. These two worlds, seemingly incompatible, somehow held their breath together, because this wasn't Greece anymore, but it wasn't fully India either. It was something new, a place between two heartbeats, where Greek philosophy began to learn to be silent. The blending didn't come from philosophy. It came from urbanization. When Alexander left the buffer zone between the Greek and Indian worlds, he accidentally created a cultural corridor where philosophy, religion, language, and architecture bumped into each other daily. And in such places, strange things happen. Greeks began learning the local language. Indians began minting coins with Zeus's image. And one day, someone, perhaps a Greek veteran or a converted noble, chanted a Buddhist mantra in Greek. If Athens gave birth to Socrates, then Ai-Khanoum may have been where he met silence. And if Alexandria in Egypt produced the greatest library of the ancient world, housing every theory of the cosmos and soul, then Ai-Khanoum felt like a nameless monastery. A place that didn't need 10,000 manuscripts to persuade you, just one statue sitting in stillness. Two Alexandrias, one storing every question, the other learning not to answer. That is the strange legacy of Alexander. He conquered the world with a sword and left behind wide open doors between civilizations. It wasn't a victory of Buddhism over Greece or the other way around. It was a moment when two civilizations didn't need to argue. They just needed to sit in the same square. And that place might have been the first gateway for Buddhism to enter the minds of the Greeks, not through commandments, not through miracles, but through a symbol. A silent statue in a red courtyard, a Doric column no longer holding a roof, but still supporting reflection. A noble choosing to carve a maxim on his tomb and let his soul choose the path. Maybe Alexander didn't know he had started all this, but what he left behind was just enough absence for two worlds to finally see each other, not through sermons, but through space for thought. Some came to India for war, others for trade, but Pyrrho came out of curiosity, curious enough to follow Alexander the Great across Persia, over the Hindu Kush, through fatigue and screaming, not to wield a sword, but to listen. Pyrrho was born in the city of Elis in western Greece, around 360 years before the Common Era. He wasn't a general, not a priest. He was a wandering philosopher, a question addict in the age of conquerors. When invited to join Alexander's philosophical entourage, he didn't hesitate. Who would turn down a trip across continents to have a conversation with the universe? Meeting the naked sages. In Taxila, an ancient city of Gandhara in present-day Pakistan, Pyrrho likely met the ones Greek texts call the gymnasiums. Taxila wasn't just a trade hub. It was a major academic center of ancient India, where Hindu, Jain, and early Buddhist schools coexisted and debated. Scholars, monks, doctors, and merchants from across the subcontinent gathered here to learn, to teach, and to listen. One can imagine Pyrrho, a wandering Greek, alien among the sounds of Sanskrit chants, the scent of incense, and the echo of temple drums. He understood none of it, but something pulled him in, as if his soul had heard this before, in another life. An old monk looked at him and smiled. No translation needed, no debate required, just presence. These wise men wore nothing, but seemed to see everything. Some were Hindu ascetics, some were Jains, and some, according to modern scholars, might have been early Buddhists. No one knows what they said to Piro, but one night, at a camp by the Indus River, Greek soldiers slept off their wine and weariness. Only Piro sat awake beside the fading embers. Above him, a sky full of stars. The only sounds, crickets and his own breath. He closed his eyes and repeated a phrase he had once heard in a language he didn't understand. Nothing is true, nothing is false, nothing lasts forever. All we know is, when he returned to Greece, he wasn't the same. A new philosophy, believing in nothing. Back in Elise, Piro didn't open a school like Plato. He didn't write books, just like the Buddha, who left no manuscripts, only a way of life and an oral tradition. Piro seemed to see no need to write anything down, no doctrines carved in stone, no definitions nailed to paper. He lived as if he himself were a question, an open question, waiting for others to answer. Instead, he grew quieter, more doubtful, and began teaching a strange kind of philosophy. Nothing is truly just or unjust, noble or shameful. All things are undecidable. Therefore, it's best not to judge anything at all. He called it suspension of judgment, and its goal was ataraxia, perfect tranquility. No distinctions, no assertions, no denials, just stillness. Sound familiar? If you're thinking, wait, this sounds familiar, you're right. Piro's thought closely mirrors the Buddhist middle way. All things are impermanent. Nothing has a fixed essence. Perception is clouded by craving and distinction. His school even used a logical tool identical to the Mahayana Buddhist tetralemma. 4 possibilities. Something can be true, false, both true and false, or neither. In Buddhist thought, this tool is a means to transcend all attachment to truth. In Piro's hands, it became a method to distrust all perception. The Buddhist who never said so. Piro never took refuge in the triple gem. He didn't shave his head. He wore no saffron robes, but he lived like a monk, poor, solitary, and silent. And he taught, happiness doesn't come from controlling the world. It comes from ceasing to judge it. No wonder modern scholars, from Thomas Machiavelli to Adrian Kuzminski, call him the first Greek Buddhist, even if he never called himself that. A quiet ripple in the river. Piro's philosophy, or Pyrrhonian skepticism, never sparked an empire of ideas. It didn't dominate schools or councils, but it left a quiet ripple in the stream of Greek thought. A small river, where western water once reflected an eastern sky. And Piro, the silent man in an age of shouting, had seen it, not through logic, but in the eyes of a monk sitting by the Indus. And if today you hear someone say, don't believe anything too quickly, try it yourself. Maybe you've just heard the echo of an unnamed monk from Taxila. Or maybe Piro, a Greek philosopher, a Buddhist, who never said so. If Piro was a drifting question from the West, then Ashoka was. The firm period the East left behind. A period carved in stone. A teaching etched into cliffside rock, in Greek. Carved in stone, sent to strangers. In 268 years before the Common Era, a king named Ashoka ascended the throne in India. He was the emperor of the Maurya dynasty, a dynasty that once ruled nearly the entire subcontinent. He took the throne after a massacre, and like many tyrants, he began with blood. But after the brutal war in Kalinga, where tens of thousands died at the hands of his own army, Ashoka changed. In the stone edicts that still survive, he wrote, "From that moment, compassion arose in me. Sorrow tormented me, and I began to follow the Dharma. Dharma, the righteous path. And to spread this path, he chose an unusual method. He carved it into stone. In Greek, not just in Indian languages, but in Greek, in the region of Kandahar, ancient Alexandria Arachosia, a city founded by Alexander the Great after his conquest of Persia in 326 years before the Common Era. Archaeologists discovered stone slabs bearing Ashoka's edicts in two languages, Greek and Aramaic. One of them, known as the Kandahar Minor Rock Edict, about 10 lines long, opens with, "You know, the reverence and faith I have for the Buddha, for the Dharma, and for the Sangha are very great. No laws, no forced commands, just trust," translated. Ashoka tried to ensure that the Greeks, the Persians, and all those who couldn't read Indian languages could still understand the Buddha. Even the style of this Greek edict closely resembles Stoic philosophy, speaking of virtue, compassion, and self-control. This was no longer an empire of swords, it was an empire of words. Translating Dharma into Eusebeia. Here's a curious detail. When translating the deep Buddhist concept of Dharma into Greek, Ashoka's scholars chose an unexpected word, Eusebeia. It means piety, reverence, or moral virtue in the Greek sense. It doesn't carry all the meanings of the original Dharma, but it was the closest the Greeks could understand. This is syncretism, a meeting point, not dilution, but encounter. A linguistic bridge between a repentant king and the Macedonian settlers living beneath the Hindu Kush. Sending a letter. He didn't stop there. In another edict, Ashoka wrote that he had sent missionaries to Egypt, Syria, and Greece, to the courts of Seleucid kings like Antiochus and Ptolemy. Can you imagine it? An Indian monk, shaved-headed, walking into the palace at Alexandria, among Corinthian columns, and bowing before a Greek king to say, "Namo Buddha." Maybe they were rejected, maybe they were laughed at, but they went, and what they planted took root. That moment, when Buddhism first stepped beyond India's borders, reminds us of another image in history, the Roman Emperor Constantine. One chose the cross, the other, the wheel of Dharma. Both, Christianity and Buddhism, spread through the hand of a converted emperor. But if Constantine issued the Edict of Milan to protect faith, Ashoka carved each Dharma teaching into stone. As an invitation, no command, no conquest, just a quiet message, offered with remorse. Nameless seeds. We don't know the names of the first Greeks who converted after reading Ashoka's edicts. No biographies, no books. We only know that, generations later, a Greek king ruled parts of India. But perhaps, even before him, there were nameless people who recognized the truth. Imagine a Greek potter in Alexandria, Arachosia, in the 3rd century before the Common Era. On a dusty afternoon, he pauses his work and looks up at a newly carved stone near the market. He reads the words, slowly, in his native language. Eusebeia, Buddha, reverence. No one teaches him the Four Noble Truths. No one asks him to chant sutras. But perhaps, in that moment, he felt something no language could describe and became a Buddhist. As for Ashoka, he didn't need anyone to record his name. He just needed to carve the stone, so that faraway Greeks could one day hear the echo of compassion. If Ashoka was the emperor who carved the Buddha into stone, then Menander was the king who placed the Buddha upon his crown. He wasn't Indian, not born in the land of the Buddha, not raised beside the Ganges, Menander was Greek, and yet he was revered as a bodhisattva, the king from Macedonia. Menander I, Melinda, who reigned roughly from 165 to 130 years before the Common Era, was one of the most prominent rulers of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. The dynasties descended from Alexander the Great's generals. He may have been born in Bactria, a former Greek territory after Alexander's conquest, or in Ai-Khanum, an ancient Greek city on the Oxus River in what is now Afghanistan. A Greek man born in the Central Asian desert, raised among Sanskrit chants, ruling a kingdom filled with monks, and yet honored as a bodhisattva. Unlike many commanders who only expanded territory, Menander expanded thought. He was the first and only Greek in recorded history to convert to Buddhism. And he didn't convert in silence. He debated. Milinda Panha, The Eternal Interview. Around 150 years before the Common Era, a Pali text appeared, Milinda Panha, The Questions of Menander. The text presents a fictional dialogue between King Menander and a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. The king asks, the monk answers, diving deep into the greatest questions. If there's no permanent soul, who reincarnates? If all things are impermanent, how can good and evil exist? And Nagasena replied, not with power, not with magic, but with quiet wisdom. Menander asked, if there is no eternal self, who is reborn? Nagasena replied, like a flame passed from one candle to another, not the same flame, yet not entirely different. Such answers were not simple, but they were powerful enough to move a king who left the throne. At the end of the text, King Menander lays down his sword. One legend says that after his final conversation with Nagasena, he returned to his palace in Sagala. The next day, as the court gathered, he did not sit the throne. He laid his sword on a silk carpet, removed his crown, and walked out bare-handed into a stunned crowd. Legend says he gave up his kingdom and became a wandering monk. We don't know if that story is true, but archaeological evidence shows he wasn't just a convert. He was a patron of Buddhism. His name appears on reliquary urns. Coins minted under his rule bear the Dharma wheel, placed between images of Zeus and Nike. On one side, Menander is depicted in a warrior's helmet, spear in hand, symbol of Greek kingship. On the other, the eight-spoked wheel of Buddhism stands as the emblem of Dharma. Together, these coins became a manifesto in metal. One side, worldly power, the other, transcendent wisdom. A king revered as a saint. According to the historian Plutarch, when Menander I died, his ashes were divided and placed in memorials, likely Buddhist stupas. No other Greek king, except him, was honored this way. No other Macedonian warrior, except him, was called a bodhisattva in Buddhist scriptures. Some Western scholars call him the Marcus Aurelius of the East, a philosopher king who knew how to let go, who questioned himself. But Menander didn't write books. He simply asked and listened. Menander didn't unite the world with a sword. He bridged two worlds with a question. If you've ever wondered, could a Greek truly understand Buddhism? Then Menander is your answer. A king who once rode Greek war horses to conquer the East chose to step down and sit across from a monk, not to fight, but to listen. And sometimes that is how Buddhism travels farthest. Imagine you are a Greek living in Gandhara in the 1st century before the Common Era. One day, as you walk past a monastery gate, you spot a statue of the Buddha, and your first reaction is, wait a second, Apollo. When the Buddha met Greek sculpture, before this period, the Buddha was not sculpted. People only represented him through symbols, footprints, a wheel, a Bodhi tree. But in the land of Gandhara, now northwest Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, where Greeks had settled after Alexander the Great, Buddhist art evolved. For the first time in history, the Buddha was sculpted as a person, and the first person to carve that form may have been a Greek artisan. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of such Buddha statues in places like Takhti-Bahi, Hada, and other sites across Gandhara. These were once home to Buddhist monasteries, and also spaces where local carving traditions merged with Hellenistic aesthetics after Alexander's conquest. Some statues date as far back as the 1st century before the Common Era, proving Greek sculptural influence remained long after the Indo-Greek kingdoms faded. The Buddha with curly hair. Buddha statues in Gandhara don't resemble later depictions. High nose, thin lips, robes that resemble Roman togas, and curly hair sculpted in the style of Apollo. Some statues even have that serene, stoic gaze, like a Greek philosopher meditating in the middle of the agora. Interestingly, from the 1st century before the Common Era onward, some Indian scholars began depicting figures like Vajrapani, the Buddha's guardian, as Heracles, strong, muscular, club in hand, as if they too were recycling Greek gods in local form, just in reverse. In classical Greek aesthetics, curly hair wasn't just a biological feature. It often symbolized divinity or wisdom, seen in figures like Apollo or Dionysus. For the Greeks, curls didn't just mean beauty, they meant insight. Aesthetic translation, not imitation. Some scholars call this Greco-Buddhism, others push back. The Greeks weren't trying to Hellenize the Buddha. They were simply imagining the Buddha using the visual language they knew. Straight nose, gentle musculature, curls symbolizing wisdom. Like how Jesus is painted with white skin in Italy and dark skin in Ethiopia. That's not historical accuracy. That's beauty, reflected through the eyes of the worshipper. Seeing the Buddha through new eyes. You could say for the first time in history, the Buddha was redrawn, not through doctrine, but through the eyes of a Greek artisan. And strangely, the statue still felt sacred. No one called it disrespectful. No one felt alienated. Imagine this. One day, an Indian monk and a Greek sculptor sit together before a block of white stone. What does the Buddha look like? The artisan asks. No one knows exactly. Just let his eyes look down at humanity with compassion. And from that vague description, a Buddha was born. Curly hair, high nose, wrapped in a toga. Perhaps because enlightenment doesn't wear just one face. Perhaps because whether the hair is curly or straight, the gaze that looks down with kindness remains the same. Whether it's Apollo or the Buddha, whether curls or a shaved head, that gaze, the one that understands and loves, never changes. Athens meets India, Plato meets Nagarjuna, and Stoicism meets meditation, not in books, but on dusty roads between brownstone monasteries in Gandhara. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a Greek school of philosophy emerged, skepticism. Pyrrho, who had once followed Alexander to India, laid its foundations. He believed nothing is certain. Therefore, the wisest thing is to suspend all judgment. A few centuries later, a Buddhist school arose, Madhyamaka. The philosopher Nagarjuna taught that nothing exists independently. Everything is empty, shunyata. There is no fixed essence, no absolute substance. One was a Greek skeptic. The other, an Indian thinker. But they were closer than we think. Both believed you shouldn't rush to believe any claims about reality. Piro doubted that perception could lead us to truth. Nagarjuna deconstructed all dualistic concepts, even the concept of existence itself. What's the result? One side leads to ataraxia, tranquility, the other to shunyata, emptiness, and both never asked others to believe them. Timon, Piro's student, once wrote, "Everything is undistinguishable, unmeasurable, and undecidable. Therefore, we should live without attachment to any opinion." This sounds no different from passages in Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Neither tradition denied the world. They denied clinging to how we interpret the world. Both Piro and Nagarjuna left no rigid systems of doctrine. They didn't demand belief. They just asked. How do we know what we see is real? Is there anything permanent? And if nothing is fixed, how should we live? For Piro, the answer was ataraxia, a serene state achieved by being free from the turmoil of judgment. Modern scholars have pointed out that both traditions, Greek and Buddhist, used a similar philosophical tool, the tetralemma. It frames questions in four possibilities: true, false, both true and false, neither true nor false. This was a common tool in Indian philosophy, and it's astonishing to see it mirrored in Greek skeptic reasoning. For Buddhism, the endpoint is nirvana, liberation from suffering through letting go of ego. Different systems, different religions, but united in one essential idea. The greatest pain is not poverty or illness. It is rigid belief in something that only seems true. If you were a Greek, used to a world of gods, logic, and personal glory, meeting a monk who said, "There is no self," might break your brain. But maybe that's why you began to listen. According to many records, Taxila, a major academic center in Gandhara, was once a place where Greek philosophers came to learn. Piro may have visited during the months he traveled with Alexander's expedition, encountering monks and hearing sermons not in theory, but in silence. Buddhism doesn't ask you to deny your experiences. It only invites you to ask, who is experiencing? And when you look long enough, the self dissolves like a thin mist. Some researchers have imagined, if you placed a Greek philosopher among a Buddhist Sangha, he might enter a form of skeptical meditation, not to find an answer, but to dwell in the space between questions. It's not philosophy, it's not religion, it's a state. Greece sought liberation through reasoning. Buddhism, through letting go of thought. One path goes from contemplation to clarity, the other from no thought to stillness. But when the end is freedom from ego, the paths, however winding, converge. The Greeks were skilled speakers. They debated, questioned, wrote dialogues. The Buddhists often just sat. No questions, no answers. And somewhere, in a forgotten stone monastery, in the winds of Central Asia, a Greek philosopher once sat down, not to find the answer, but to stop searching. It may have been Piro, it may have been an unnamed traveler, or maybe it was you. If Socrates stopped asking, stopped debating, stopped dissecting, and just sat, breathed in and breathed out, what would he see? If you were walking through eastern Afghanistan around the 1st century after the birth of Christ and came across a stone slab carved with strange words like Namo Obodo, Namo U, you might think it was a joke. But it wasn't. This was a Buddhist mantra, transcribed in Greek, not Sanskrit, not Pali, not the temple-toned elegance of classical Chinese. This inscription was written in Bactrian Greek, a Hellenized dialect that used the classical Greek alphabet. It was the only Greek script ever officially used in Central Asia, particularly from the 1st century before the Common Era to about the 4th century after. Though written left to right like standard Greek, the carved letters alpha, lambda, omega often appear warped, as if the alphabet itself were meditating. You might recognize the omega, curling like a little wave. The slab was found near Ai-Khanum, one of the most renowned Hellenistic cities in ancient Bactria, located by the Oxus River. This land once had theatres, Corinthian columns, even a gymnasium dedicated to Hermes. But this stele didn't speak of Greek gods. It whispered something else. And you'd wonder, who chants to the Buddha? In Greek, a Bactrian Buddhist, possibly a converted Greek, living on the Buddhist frontier. They didn't just recite the mantra, they wrote it, carved it, entrusted it to stone. This mantra had no translation. No one really knew what Namo Obodo meant, but they still chanted it. The way many people today sing Hallelujah without knowing it comes from Hebrew. Faith doesn't always live in meaning. Sometimes it lives in repetition, in a long, resonant sound that carries the mind beyond reason. The stone slab wasn't a declaration. Just as many modern devotees still recite Namo Amitabha or Om Mani Padme Hum without needing a translation, because what they seek isn't grammar. It's the presence of the sacred through repeated sound. It was a whisper, a presence. Ashoka once inscribed his edicts in Greek and Aramaic, sending them across Western Asia, including the famous Kandahar Edict, carved around 258 years before the Common Era. That text used formal classical Greek to explain Buddhist ethics, filial piety, humility, civic responsibility. In it, the Dharma was translated as eusebia, piety, reverence. But some followers didn't translate. They simply wrote the sound, like copying a sacred code, not to understand, but to preserve the vibration. That's not misunderstanding. It's a different understanding. This isn't a story about language. It's a story about sincerity. A Greek man, living far from home, among the rocky hills of Central Asia, in an age without Zeus, chose to keep a mantra, even if he didn't understand it, even if he wrote it wrong. He still carved it into stone, still faced east, still whispered, not because he mastered the teachings, not because he had a teacher, but simply because he needed something to hold on to in the silence. If a mantra is misread, but still helps someone stay grounded in the desert of doubt, was it ever really wrong? Namo, Obodo, a sound no one can explain anymore. But perhaps, within that silence, the Buddha still hears. Not everyone goes up a mountain to meditate. Some people roam the borders, translating every word of the Buddha into Greek. And they, the translators of the Dharma, are the quietest bridges in history. The ones who rewrote truth. Around 258 years before the Common Era, Ashoka, the great Buddhist emperor of India, had the Kandahar Edict carved in Greek and Aramaic. Beyond Kandahar, his edicts appeared in places like Taxila, Lagman, and Sirkap, using a mix of local languages such as Greek, Aramaic, and Kharosti. Each inscription targeted a specific audience, Greek, Persian, or Indian, and reveals a religious outreach strategy that was both nuanced and pragmatic. This wasn't a diplomatic memo. It was a personal confession from a king who had waged war, felt remorse, and now sent out teachings of compassion. From that day onward, compassion took hold of my heart. But how could a Greek stonecutter, living on the Bactrian frontier, fully grasp the Dharma in order to translate it? The answer is, they weren't translating doctrines, they were translating states of being. Dharma, translated as Eusebia. The word Dharma, one of the most profound Buddhist concepts, was rendered in Greek as Eusebia. Elsewhere, translators used dikaiosine, righteousness, to convey right action, or sophrosine, moderation, to describe ethical restraint. These translators weren't seeking replicas, they were seeking resonance. The words didn't mean the same, but they touched the same place, the moral life. Eusebia in ancient Greek culture meant reverence toward gods, ancestors, and the community, a way of behaving rightly toward the universe around you. Dharma, same thing. And there, between two civilizations, the sacred found a word. When translation becomes a spiritual journey, Dharma translators weren't just converting words. Some were scholars, but others were just stonemasons, living on the frontier with no classrooms, no curriculum. Picture a dusty afternoon in 250 years before the Common Era in Kandahar. A small Greek man, hair streaked with grit, holds a chisel and hammer. Before him is a rough transliteration of a Pali text. He reads slowly, nods, and carves the word Eusebia into stone. He carries an entire worldview, a value system, and a cultural soul from one language into another. Across every surviving inscription, from Kandahar to Ai-Khanoum, we find something curious. No two versions are exactly alike. No version is complete, not because they didn't know how to standardize, but because every language has limits and spirit does not. As if imperfection itself allowed Buddhism to live in a new land. When translation becomes meditation. If you've ever translated an ancient poem, you understand. You're not just replacing words. You're listening to the author's spirit, then speaking it in your own tongue. Same here. When the Greeks rendered Dharma as Eusebia, it wasn't a mistake. They were placing a teaching into ears that could hear it. It was a risk, but also an act of love. Not everyone is a meditation master, but anyone can wrap a truth in their own words and offer it to someone else. Sometimes awakening doesn't begin with a sermon, but with a translation, imperfect, but deeply sincere. These translators may not have left names, but they left behind a third language, a place where two cultures didn't just meet, they embraced. There's something strange about history. It never ends neatly like a novel. There's no happily ever after, no triumphant final chapter, only dusty roads and questions left open. Where did Buddhism go? The Indo-Greek kingdoms eventually fell. Buddhism faded in the region of Bactria, washed away by Islam, by empires, by the tides of time. The Greek inscriptions about the Dharma remained on stone. No one read them. No one chanted them. The rain and wind eroded them until only faint traces remained. And then, 2,000 years later, someone found them again. A German scholar sat hunched over a stone in Ai-Khanoum and realized this is a Buddhist mantra written in Greek. And the story suddenly came back to life. No one ever fully walks away from the teaching. Maybe the kings forgot. Maybe the cities crumbled. Maybe the missionaries live only in myth. But the seeds of belief don't vanish. They drift quietly, through lullabies, through a passing greeting, through the eyes of a salt trader from Turkey. And sometimes, belief outlives even the language that gave it birth. An old story for those still awake. You're reading these words on a night that may be very quiet or very turbulent. Maybe you don't follow Buddhism, don't follow Greece, don't care about Ashoka or Menander or the word Eusebeia. But if you've ever felt that the world is too full of contradiction, and if you've ever looked for something to hold on to, even if it's just a single rhythmic breath, then maybe you've touched the same thing they once searched for. Not a correct belief, not an answer, but a kind of stillness that means something. History never really ends. It just changes costume. This story has no conclusion, only a wish. May you become a translator of the Dharma by slowing down and listening in every breath for something that cannot be translated. Good night.